production and the role of global value chains. And Isabel will be talking for about 4 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 minutes at the end for questions. So please welcome Isabel.
Okay, thank you very much, Ida, and thanks everyone for being here today to talk about the globalization of production, which, as Chris mentioned in his email when he advertised the lecture, I think is one of the most important issues that we can turn our attention to at the moment, because without it, we can't really understand what's going on in the global capitalist system, what's going on in global production and exchange. And unfortunately, this is a topic that is often too neglected within the mainstream economics education. And it's ironic because production is really, production and global exchange is really at the core of what we should be trying to understand as economists. Most economists study global exchange through trade, investment, financial exchange, but all too often they don't really focus on what's actually going on in the process of creation of value and the process of the creation of the goods and services that satisfy human needs, which is really what we should probably be focusing on. Fortunately, this is starting to change lately, and it's starting to change because economists are becoming aware that the structure of global production is changing, and that concepts that are based on trade theory, that are based on financial theory, aren't sufficiently grounded and are perhaps too abstract to really capture the realities of economic activity around the world. And what's particularly interesting is that it's not just economists and fringe economists that are looking at this, but this is becoming a mainstream way of looking at issues of global economic exchange within places like the WTO or the OECD or UNCTAD, which are the organizations that really dictate the way that we look at issues of economic exchange from a policy perspective and make prescriptions that shape the way that countries actually address these issues. So I wanted to share with you one quote that I think reflects a shared sentiment and a shared change of perspective that's taking place within large multilaterals like the WTO, but that reflects work that's been done previously by both heterodox and now more and more mainstream economists that are turning their attention to this issue. And it says, this is in a report that was prepared by Elms and Lowe for the WTO in 2013, and they say, any discussion today of international trade and investment policy that fails to acknowledge the centrality of global value chains, or GVCs, would be considered outmoded and of questionable relevance. The idiom might vary, referring to trade and value added, production sharing, supply chains, outsourcing, offshoring, vertical integration, or fragmented production instead of GVCs, but the core notion of internationally joined up production is the same. So this is a very strong statement, especially coming from an agency like the WTO. It's telling us if we don't look at global value chains, if we don't look at global production, we don't understand what's going on. The perspective and the lens of trade and investment simply isn't enough anymore. So this is the issue that we'll be talking about today, and we're structuring the lecture in 3 parts. The first part will be devoted to looking at what we mean by this concept of globalization of production, and where does this notion of global value chains fit within the larger phenomenon that is the globalization of production. Then, in part 2, we're going to be asking ourselves, why is there this shift from the trade and investment paradigm to global value chains, and what are the particular features of global exchange in the GVC era that have motivated this shift in perspective, and what do they imply for the theory and for the methodology that we use to study global exchange. Then in part 3, we're going to look at the implications of globalization in terms of industrial development and inequality. So what do these changes in global production mean in terms of developing countries' capacity to reach industrial development, and also what does it mean for the way that the value generated in global value chains is distributed? What are the distributional impacts of global value chains? The takeaways that I think we need to remember from this lecture are 2. And the first one is divided into 2 points. So the first one refers to the nature of this process of globalization of production in the past 40 or so years. So we know that global economic exchange is by no means a new phenomenon. What is relatively new, however, is the disintegration of production of manufactured goods into global value chains and into global production networks. And as we'll see later on, this poses a challenge to the theory of comparative advantage. We'll come back to that in a minute. The second point is that oligopolization and the unprecedented concentration of global industrial production to fewer and fewer elite firms is another of the key characteristics of globalization of production over the past 40 years. And as we'll see later, this poses a challenge to neoclassical firm theory. The second takeaway is that the dynamics of this wave of globalization seem to be reproducing inequality between rich and poor countries, which is something that's been studied for some time and seems to be reproduced in this new wave through the processes that we will examine. But at the same time, some people argue that because the manufacturing process is now being disintegrated, this can also provide opportunities for developing countries to engage in global value chains and gain from that process and achieve even industrial development, which is quite questionable, as we will see in a minute. Okay, so part one. What do we talk about? What do we mean when we talk about the globalization of production? First of all, why do we talk about globalization of production rather than economic globalization, which has been the buzzword, the predominant buzzword until quite recently? As I said before, typically economic globalization has been understood through the lens of trade and investment. So the narrative here is that trade is increasing, investment is increasing, and it's increasing because of technological development that has facilitated the exchange of goods and services, and also because of the erosion of trade barriers that previously prevented these exchanges from taking place. I think this is a well-known narrative, and we can obviously go into it later if you're interested. However, I think it's quite well known. And this process of economic exchange through trade, through investment, is very old. It's older than we often think. And Andre Gunder Frank has even pointed out that even as far back as the 4th millennium before the Common Era, we can already look and say that a global economic system already existed. So this is by no means new. However, this is quite interesting actually. This is, without even going so far back as the 4th millennium, looking at the 8th century AD, you can already see that there's a very well-established system of trade between Eurasia and Africa, where people are trading wine, beer, amber, corn, iron, timber. So you have the exchange already of commodities like iron and timber, like corn, but also the exchange of manufactured or relatively manufactured products with some value added like wine and beer. And this goes far back, much further than the 8th century AD. Okay, so global exchange is not new. What is new, however, is that whereas until very recently, global exchange had been confined mostly to finished goods or commodities, recently, and we're speaking, economists think about the past 40 years or so, there's been a different kind of international exchange that's become more prominent, and that's the exchange of intermediate goods and services that are incorporated into the production of finished manufactured products through global value chains or global production networks that are becoming broader and more geographically disintegrated. So this is a new feature. And there's empirical evidence for this. Here I just present 3 key indicators, but there's many more ways of looking at this. But even as far back as 3 decades ago, there were already studies pointing to the fact that international trade is now largely comprised of intermediate non-final products, and that these non-final products are not predominantly primary products. They're not just commodities, but they're products that already have received some value added. So most of the trade in the world is of intermediate products and not just commodities, but products that already have some value incorporated into them, some value that's been added to them. Here, a second lens through which this process of integration of production has been studied is by comparing the dynamics of foreign direct investment relative to the dynamics of trade. So here, this graph just shows FDI as a proportion of trade, and we see how it's been increasing. This is just from 1995 to 2005, but it's a process that's been going on for much longer. So what does this mean? This means that because we have bilateral investment treaties, because we have trade agreements that involve the deregulation of investment and at the same time the protection of investors' rights, investors feel more capable of investing in other countries and outsourcing their operations, disintegrating their operations, and then structuring a global value chain that allows them to reap more benefit and to more efficiently organize production by outsourcing different activities throughout the world. Then the third point has to do with the measurement of the disintegration of production through the lens of the foreign content of exports. And we see that between 1995 and 2009, the foreign content of exports has increased, and it's increased sometimes very dramatically, in all but 12 of the 56 countries that are currently in the OECD database that measures trade and value added. What's interesting about this also is that this database is very new. It's just in the process of being created. And so far, it only has data going back to 1995. So this increase in the foreign content of exports here is only measured from 95 to 2009. And the reason for this is that even though economists have been aware of the fact that this change in the structure of trade and production is taking place, and they've been aware of this for a very long time, the resources, the data that's available, and the way that we look at trade, and we've been examining trade for a very long time, is still very far behind, and we haven't made the changes methodologically to be able to generate data that allows us to see trade in a more disintegrated and nuanced way. And one very tangible example of this is the controversy that you may have heard over who's reaping the benefits from the iPhone trade. So there was a common narrative a while back that even though Apple is a US-based company, because the US was importing finished iPhones from China, then allegedly the US had a trade deficit to the tune of $1.9 billion with China just as a result of the iPhone trade. However, as all of you I'm sure know, it's not like China is actually making the entire iPhone all by itself and then selling it to the US. On the contrary, when you actually see where the value is being added in the process of production of the iPhone in different places, you see that Japan accounts for 34% of the value added in the iPhone, Germany 17%, South Korea 13%, China 3.6%, and the US 6%. So 6% versus 3.6%, clearly the US is adding more value, and that's reflected in the value-added approach of examining iPhone benefits. So when you actually see the US trade deficit with China of $1.9 billion being disaggregated, the trade deficit disappears, and what you actually see is a $48 million trade surplus that the US has with China in the iPhone trade. However, at the same time, the US does have a trade deficit in the iPhone trade with Japan, with Germany, with Korea, and with other countries. So what does that mean? That means that the US still seems to be losing out. However, if you stop looking just at value added and you add another layer of analysis and look at profits, again, the picture changes. You see that Apple is actually taking 58.5% of the profits from the sale of iPhones. Then you have the EU making a tiny bit of profits, 1.1, Taiwan 0.5, Japan 0.5, South Korea 4.7. And then you have other categories here. You have the cost of inputs from Chinese labor and the cost of inputs from materials. 2 points about this. First of all, these kinds of analyses of value added and that try to break down the distributional, the way that value is distributed in the production of certain products do have certain problems, and they can be reflected here. Here you see that instead of talking about profits in each of the countries involved, sometimes the analysis talks about profits, sometimes about cost of input, sometimes about labor. So this mixing of categories is problematic because you could argue, for example, that when you're talking about cost of inputs, you should also be talking about breaking that further down into the labor that goes into the inputs and the profits that are derived from extracting those inputs. But this is all a much more technical discussion that we don't have time to go into at the moment. The point to remember, however, is that even though the US, as we saw in the previous slide, is only adding 6% of the value involved in the creation of the iPhone, it is nevertheless deriving 58.5% of the profits. So how do we explain that? How do we explain the fact that there's this huge difference between how much value the US is adding and how much profit Apple, this US-based company, is taking? And this is not just a question that applies to the case of Apple and the iPhone, but it's a question that applies to most TNCs in general that lead global value chains or that organize global production networks. Why is it that these firms are able to appropriate so much of the gains from global value chains? And there are two possible explanations for this, or there are at least two narratives that you see commonly in the literature on globalized production. First, the simple neoclassical narrative that comes from the perspective of trade theory would tell you that the reason Apple is able to concentrate so much of the profit share from the production of the iPhone is because they're concentrating on the higher value-added segments of the value chain, in this case, product design and marketing. And they're concentrating in these segments because they have a comparative advantage in terms of relative factor endowments. So the explanation here would be because the US has a very highly skilled workforce and human capital that's capable of designing these very nifty products, that's where most of the value is being created. Therefore, it takes a larger share of the profits, of the wealth generated in the process of creation of the iPhones. That's, okay, maybe an interesting explanation. However, it has some problems, which we will discuss later. The second interpretation that comes not just from heterodox economists, but also from some neoclassical economists that are turning to firm theory to explain what we just saw in the previous slide, says that the reason that TNCs are able to derive more of the profit share from global value chains is because they have larger market power, larger market share, and they use that market power to structure the creation and to structure the distribution of value along the supply chain in a way that allows it to maximize profits for itself. And what's very interesting here is that this narrative that comes from the perspective of firm theory, that's looking at how TNCs structure production, is being used more and more, even by neoclassical economists and even by entities like the WTO, that used to look at these issues from the perspective of trade. So no longer are they turning to the theory of comparative advantage, they're turning more to firm theory, even within neoclassical economics, to explain how exchange is taking place in the process of production. And the reason I think they're doing that is because firm theory, and even neoclassical firm theory, is more capable of examining global exchange from a perspective that incorporates the political and the institutional variables that heterodox economists have always known are a part of economic exchange. So whereas neoclassical trade theory tells you that the way exchange is structured has to do strictly with factor endowments, and it's a very natural process, in firm theory, at least you acknowledge that the firm is an agent that structures production, and that in this case structures exchange along the production network. So as a result of this weakness in comparative advantage and neoclassical trade theory, firm theory is becoming more prominent within these analyses, even in mainstream economics, even in the WTO. And this general shortcoming of the theory of comparative advantage also reflects a wider problem with neoclassical theory that has to do with its inability to understand economic flows and economic dynamics as a political process. And this is something that Jack's lecture next week will be building upon quite significantly, I believe. Okay, so the first point was we're shifting from trade theory to firm theory to explain global exchange. The second point I'd like to make is that even when neoclassical or mainstream discourse appropriates firm theory to explain global exchange, there are certain limitations to that explanation. Because as we know in mainstream firm theory, neoclassical firm theory, what should be happening is something akin to Marshall's analogy of the trees in a forest, right? So a firm can only get so big before it starts experiencing diseconomies of scale, and then younger, more vigorous firms compete to the extent that this large firm then falls, and so firms rise and fall like trees in a forest through competitive pressures, and as a result, no firm is ever able to maintain a monopoly position for very long and abuse that position and create a situation like the one we saw previously where it's appropriating such a large share of profits and exerting its power over its competitors and over the rest of its supply chain. That shouldn't happen. However, what seems to be happening is not something that reflects this theory, but something that's much more akin to what's been proposed by Marx or Chandler or Penrose, who don't see the Marshall analogy of the trees in a forest as something that should necessarily ever happen. On the contrary, they think that there shouldn't be and there isn't any limit to the growth of the firm. They believe that firms can continue to grow and become as big as they like and as monopolistic as they like, and there aren't any reasons to think that something should stop this from happening. And that is what we keep seeing. We keep seeing consolidation of large firms, of TNCs, into fewer and fewer hands. And we have a situation now in which most of industrial global production, at least in very high value added industries like aerospace, for instance, you not only have oligopolistic competition, but even duopolistic competition. So for instance, in the market for large commercial airliners, Boeing and Airbus are pretty much the only two companies that can manufacture these anymore. That's it. And this is a theory that's much more developed with lots of empirical evidence by Peter Nolan. If you guys aren't familiar with his work, I think his book on the global business revolution is very enlightening and has a lot of very strong empirical evidence that pretty much proves the point that was being made by Chandler and Penrose and Marx. But Nolan also points to another effect. Not only are we seeing the consolidation and the oligopolization of industrial production at the very top levels of the supply chains, but we're also seeing this cascading down into the second-tier suppliers, first-tier suppliers, well, first and second-tier suppliers, et cetera, et cetera. So in the case of Boeing and Airbus, not only do we have two companies that are monopolizing or oligopolizing or duopolizing, I guess in this case, the market for large commercial jetliners, but we also see them exerting pressures on the people who make their engines, who make their control systems, and so much pressure to cut costs and to increase quality that then their first-tier suppliers have to merge in order to be able to cut costs and invest sufficiently in research and development to be able to maintain their positions as the main suppliers for Boeing and Airbus. So you see consolidation taking place all the way down the value chain. So to recapitulate this section, 3 main points. First, this rise of GVCs, which is dominating the discourse on the globalization of production recently, refers to the increasing fragmentation of production of manufactured goods, which is a relatively recent phenomenon, though global exchange is not. Secondly, TNCs are concentrating more and more market share, more and more market power, and greater profit shares. And thirdly, the study of globalized production from the GVC perspective poses certain challenges to neoclassical trade theory and firm theory, and these challenges are due in large part to the inability of these theories to account for the political and the institutional variables that shape trade and that shape economic exchange. Okay, we still have some time, so part 3, what are the implications of the globalization of production for industrial development and for inequality? So we've seen the implications of this restructuring of global trade, of global exchange, for the theories and the methodologies that we have to explain these processes, but now how does this process impact these 2 very important issues that concern us as economists and potentially as policymakers if anybody wants to go down that road? Here I've divided the interpretations of the impacts of globalization of production not into heterodox and orthodox interpretations, but into groups of people who are more enthusiastic about what global value chains may offer to developing countries or in terms of inequality, and people who are less enthusiastic about it. So people who are enthusiastic about global value chains have 2 main points to make. First, they believe that developing countries will benefit from increased participation in manufacturing. And if you were around last year for Justein's lecture, he talked about the centrality of manufacturing in the process of economic upgrading, of industrial development. And I won't go into it right now because it's a rather long discussion, but if you want to go into that, I would highly recommend that you look at Justein's lecture. The point, however, is that manufacturing is central to development, and because global value chains are disintegrating the manufacturing process, developing countries can now participate in that process and reap the benefits from making the shift from commodity producers to manufacturers. The second argument is that by incorporating themselves into value chains, they can then use the market power that's secured by powerful lead firms to be able to secure a market for whatever products they produce for those lead firms. And that, of course, may be legitimate in some cases if a developing country is actually successful in securing a very stable, steady spot within the production network. But that's, as we discussed earlier, very difficult to do because there's so much competitive pressure and so much pressure to consolidate going all the way down the value chain. Then the perspective of those who are more skeptical about the benefits of global value chains can also be divided into 2 main points. First of all, there's the observation that poor countries, even though they are participating more in the manufacturing process, are being relegated still to producing low value-added products, and they have difficulty upgrading into higher links in the supply chain. And there's extensive literature on this, which I'd be happy to recommend, but it's a pretty well-established point. And secondly, the legal regime that's facilitated this process has reduced policy space for industrial policy. So free trade agreements, bilateral investment treaties, are not only limiting, the conventional mechanisms of tariffs and quotas, but also the mechanisms of technology transfer, government procurement, activist investment by the state. And these were all tools that were conventionally or traditionally, historically, have been available to countries that have successfully industrialized. So this legal regime that at the same time is facilitating the creation of global value chains is limiting the capacity of developing countries to engage in those value chains in a way that's advantageous to them through industrial policy. Sorry. Okay. And as far as the distributional impacts are concerned, those who are skeptical about global value chains point out that most of the value that's created in the chains is empirically being shown to accrue mostly to rich countries. In this study by UNCTAD from 2003, it's been stated that 67% of value added in global value chains accrues to OECD countries, 8% goes to newly industrialized countries, like the first tier NICs, 3% goes to the second tier NICs, 9% to China, 5% to other BRICS, and only 8% to all other developing countries. So clearly, that is not a very hopeful picture. And these kinds of statistics have led some economists to wonder if what we're seeing nowadays is a modern-day Prebisch-Singer trap. And in a nutshell, the Prebisch-Singer trap essentially says that if a country is specializing in commodities and trading with another country that's specializing in manufactured products, then the terms of trade between the 2 countries are not only asymmetrical, but will continue to become more and more asymmetrical as time goes by, because countries specializing in manufacturers are capable of gaining more productivity gains, where those specializing in commodities cannot make the same kind of productivity gains. So what we see is a divergence over time. Now, that kind of analysis used to be applied to exchange between commodity producers and manufacturers, but some economists like Milberg and Winkler here, and Kaplinski as well, I believe, have been pointing to the fact that what we see now is the reproduction of the same kind of dynamic of asymmetry and increasing asymmetry in the manufacturing sector. So now even when you have trade between two countries that aren't focusing on manufacturing, you still have the same kind of dynamic of deteriorating terms of trade. And this is not only something that's being observed by economists or by heterodox economists. Here we have a quote by Forbes that's making the same point in different words. It says, basic manufacturing, like electronics assembling type manufacturing, simply isn't a high value added occupation anymore. And the level of wages that can be paid in any particular occupation depend inexorably on the amount of value that the occupation adds. So if electronics assembly adds little value, then there simply cannot be high wages for those doing that work, for it just isn't a high value added occupation. Now, this is the same point. I think it's very problematic because it's also confusing value with profits and with prices, which is also something I would invite you to think about, because in neoclassical theory, there is a consistent confusion or conflation of price with value, and that's particular to neoclassical theory. That's not something that you see, for instance, in Marxist theory. So that's something to be revisited. But we don't have time to go into that now. What's also interesting about these different views about the implications of global value chains in terms of distribution and in terms of industrial development is that even though you have a clear divergence in opinion about the relative benefits or drawbacks of what's going on in global production, and you have some people who are very pessimistic about it while some are quite optimistic about it, the enthusiasts and the pessimists have the same policy prescriptions. So there's not really a different set of answers that's coming out of these different assessments. And their policy prescriptions essentially boil down to two key things. First, that countries should seek to engage in global value chains in which they're more likely to achieve industrial upgrading into high value-added activities. And secondly, that they should aim for activities in which industrial upgrading or economic upgrading is also coupled with social upgrading. So seeking out activities in which not only will you be able to generate more high value-added products, but also activities in which you're likely to gain better wages and better labor conditions. So the analysis for developing countries, or the challenge for policymakers, is to seek out those sectors in their industrial policy planning. However, in both of these prescriptions, the underlying presumption is that global value chains and the structuring of global production and global value chains led by large TNCs is just a fact of life, and we need to learn how to cope with it. And I think that begs the question, quote unquote, about whether or not conventional industrial policy is dead. So the policy that was used by early industrializers and by the first-tier NICs and the second-tier NICs, and especially the first-tier NICs, is that policy still feasible, or is industrialization only possible through global value chains? Is it impossible for poor countries nowadays, for developing countries, to aim to compete with lead firms in global value chains? Is it possible for China, for instance, that's been trying to build a successful commercial jetliner for the past 30 years, to one day compete with Boeing and Airbus? According to many, that's simply not possible anymore. And if it's not possible for China, what does that mean for the rest of developing countries? And I don't have any kind of satisfying answer to that, but I leave that open question to you for discussion, and I'd be interested to hear your opinions. And I also have some questions that I've outlined here that could be essay questions that you could either write for paper 0 or even write for your classes if there's the opportunity to do it within the context of your coursework. But they're questions that I wish I had the time to think about and answer. So if you guys have the opportunity, I highly recommend it, because I think they would really help to clarify the picture of what's going on in this process of global exchange. So the first question is, can neoclassical trade theory and firm theory be reformulated to explain the dynamics of global exchange? I think this is a key question, and I think there aren't enough people thinking about it, because people have basically shifted to the global value chain paradigm, but they're not really thinking about the theoretical implications, and they're not developing a new kind of theory to explain what's going on. The second question is, what is the notion of value employed in global value chain literature, and how does it relate to the concept of value in different economic theories? Again, a key question. I mean, after all, as economists, we should have a really clear sense of what value is and what it means to us. But most of us have never had the opportunity to really think deeply about this. I know that was definitely the case for me until very recently. And then finally, another interesting question for an essay or for empirical research, even for a dissertation, is what are the distributional outcomes of production organized in global value chains for, insert the name of the industry, it could be the apparel industry, the electronics industry, any industry you like. And because there isn't so much data in well-established databases so far about the distribution of value along global value chains, what you have right now is a lot of sectoral studies. So there's a lot of data out there coming from people who study particular industries about how value is distributed in those industries. But it's all quite dispersed and disconnected, so it would be really interesting for somebody to take that information and synthesize it and make some meaning out of it. So those are the questions I leave you with, and here's also a list of further readings. I would especially recommend this handbook by Kaplinsky, the Handbook for Value Chain Research. I think it synthesizes some of the main arguments within the global value chain discussion very well, and it's very clear in terms of setting out some key methodological elements for studying global value chains. And then this book by Milberg and Winkler, Outsourcing Economics, Global Value Chains in Capitalist Development, I think is the most serious and most comprehensive effort to think theoretically about what's going on in terms of globalized production. And the other two that I've recommended, as well as many more that I would be able to recommend, are also quite interesting, but those two I think are key. So that's that. Thank you for your time, and if you have any questions now or later, feel free to write me. That is my information. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much. So we have some time for questions if anyone has any. Yep.
Thank you very much. Great talk. So you talked about inequality between the rich and the poor countries. What about inequality within rich countries? So, yeah, if you look at the Apple case, working class Americans may say that most of the jobs have gone to China, and even though they retain a lot of the profit, that's going to the American managers, the high-end guys like the computer scientists. So the poor guy who's working in a manufacturing shop now has no job, and he hasn't been retrained to become a computer programmer to get those exciting jobs. And it may be unrealistic to expect in a country of 310 million people to expect everyone to be doing the high-end jobs. So there's, these guys probably want their government, the American working class they want their government to, do something to keep their jobs. Because it's not exciting that Apple is getting bigger if the rich just get richer in America and not the.
Absolutely. I completely agree. In fact, one of the main problems that I have with the way that global value chain research is being done is that, like I said, it has a very hazy concept of how value is distributed. And part of that has to do with the fact that they're looking at value in terms of exchanges between countries sometimes and exchanges within the production process and not taking into account what happens after the products are sold. So I think one of the interesting avenues to explore to correct that would be to use the concept of surplus value instead. Because that's when you actually start seeing how much of the profits being derived from global value chains are going to labor, how much of it is going to capital. And then the geographical element is also an element, but it's not the key element in seeing how value is distributed. So I haven't seen anybody doing that, applying surplus value to analyze the breakdown of the distribution of value along value chains. But I think that's a challenge that needs to be taken on by someone who has time for that. But yeah, I think surplus value and the international division of labor, or even the division of labor within countries as related to global value chains, would be an interesting way to clarify exactly how profits are being distributed. But yeah, that's also one of the drawbacks in general with the way that trade is analyzed. It's analyzed as between countries, when what you're actually seeing is division of value and creation of value according to classes. And that's much more enlightening. And that's something that's also been much more developed in non-neoclassical theory. So yeah, I completely agree. Yes.
When you're talking about the iPhone, is that value just goes to the price, or how does it get measured?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Let me go back to that. Yeah. The methodology here that I didn't have to take time to look at in too much depth at all, actually, but what I intuited based on the figures that are shown here is that this is taking into account the price of the inputs that go into the production process, and that incorporates labor inputs and material inputs, so the prices. And what's interesting here is that it only goes up, as you can see here, to $178.96. And as we know, we pay a lot more than that for iPhones, to the tune of $500 to $1,000. So it's only the prices that are taken into account until the iPhone is ready and sold to the States to then be distributed. So everything else that happens after the products get to the States or to their final markets is actually here. And that's the final price of the product.
You mentioned that the main reason that America is able to retain so much of the profit is because intellectual capital is in America, and so basically the raw material and the manufacturing is elsewhere. What would happen if, say, the countries in which the assembling and the raw material is actually assembled were to charge more? Or is it, because you kept mentioning Marx, or is it that there's so many countries that are willing to do that they're unable to that there's so much surplus labor that they're unable to do that? Or
sure.
Is it possible that they could ask for more profit because they are the ones actually assembling?
Right. Yeah, that is a big question, right? Because you do have so much supply of labor that's willing to extract those materials and do the basic assembly that there is a supply and demand dynamic at work that makes it difficult for them to charge higher prices. But at the same time, it's not that it can be boiled down just to supply and demand. There's also lots of political factors and lots of power dynamics that go into ensuring that those countries aren't able to charge more or upgrade into higher links in the supply chain. One interesting proposal to address that is coming out of the Union of South American Nations right now. I used to work in Ecuador in industrial policy, so I'm quite familiar with the efforts that are being made to address just that issue. And one proposal that I saw was that we could create a cartel of commodity exporters so that we could charge higher prices for the commodities that we're extracting. Because, for instance, the lithium that goes into iPhones, a lot of it comes from Bolivia, which is a neighboring, sort of neighboring country to Ecuador, where I'm from. So Bolivia and a few other countries are thinking about creating a cartel that would ensure that they get higher profits for the lithium and therefore be able to pay higher wages to the workers who extract the lithium. But you have to have some kind of political orchestration to be able to pull that off. And of course, you'll have a lot of pressure from Apple or Apple suppliers to prevent that from happening. So the name of the game is politics there. And I'm sure Jack will be elaborating on that as well. Sorry, just 1 second.
Just in response to that, would that be in line with WTO policies, or would that be?
No, I don't think it would.
Yeah.
That's another problem. Yeah, but you can also, that doesn't need to mean that you can't do it. A lot of countries violate WTO regulations consistently, and not just very powerful countries, also developing countries, and they get away with it. They can only prosecute so many countries at a time. Yeah, please.
I have a question related to the earlier one about methodology. I was wondering, to what extent, your talk was great, by the way, but to what extent do you think that you mentioned there was a problem with data in a lot of this.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think that's related to the structure of multinational corporations and the fact that they can essentially often define where value comes from themselves based upon optimizing the tax regime, etc. So do you think it's possible ever to have a detailed enough analysis of this without then maybe political pressure to have different ways of firm accounting?
Yeah, I think that's probably the most important problem that there is with generating adequate data. You don't have transparency or any requirements to have sufficient transparency from transnationals to be able to see what's actually happening in their supply chain. And even when you do, it's very difficult to have and to process the production function of every product that's produced by every supplier of every TNC and to capture that and synthesize it. But in theory, if you had that information available, yeah, it could be done. It would require a lot of people working very hard on it, but it could be done. But the will just isn't there, and of course it's not in the interests of corporations to disclose that fully. Yes?
So my question is about kind of also touching upon this, but I was thinking to what extent it would be possible for industrial policy of developing country to actually promote firms that would take a niche in supply chain of manufacturing product that would be an intermediate, because assumption is you can't just jump producing a commodity, given that a lot of those markets, for example, for commercial airliners, work not through the free market, whoever sells me like the part of the plane the cheapest, but rather through contracts. So it's lump sum, it's win-all situation. And facing that, you cannot just protect your industry. You need to have access to such firm. So such firm needs to let you produce for for that.
Right.
So do you, and given that, you know, more and more countries want to follow, would like to follow probably that model to develop, so try to scale up manufacturally, wouldn't that mean that, you know, each market for the intermediary product will be so suffocated that at some point some countries will need to remain poor, basically, will not be able to get there because the rest is already on that place?
Yes, I would say yes to that last part. That does seem to be the case. But as far as the kind of industrial policy measures that you can take, there are some countries that are doing that very actively. Singapore is a good example. They've managed to specialize in, I think, the maintenance of aircraft, which is a service, but it's a service that's very closely tied to manufacturing. And that, I mean, there's some debate about what classifies as a service and what classifies as manufacturing. And in this case, it's a service that's so tied to the manufacturing process that it's considered very high value added. So they've specialized in this and they're deriving a lot of profits from it, and it's been a very successful policy. However, you do have to have very strong and very focused state action for that to be pulled off. In the case of Singapore, it's a very, contrary to what people think, it's a very activist state. I mean, they own, I think, 80% of the land in the country. The state owns 80% of the land. I think 20% of its economy is state-owned corporations. So, of course, they have the will and the focus to be able to pull this off. I can tell you that in the case of Ecuador, we have not had the same experience. Even though we had a lot of interest in creating activist industrial policy, we haven't been able to target a sector and focus on it to the same extent, and consequently have had a very dispersed industrial policy. But yeah, I mean, I think the idea of joining global value chains in a way that aims at a higher value-added segment is very valid. That said, at the same time, I think it's very risky to not at the same time engage in a more activist and more ambitious policy. In the case of Korea, for instance, you had Koreans assembling Nikes for, I think, 20 years to generate foreign exchange, but at the same time they were developing the technology to create their own semiconductors. So we have to play both games at the same time, I think. But yeah, it's still a competitive game between developing countries to see who can insert themselves most quickly and in the right place. Yes. Any more questions? Okay, thank you very much.